Early autumn arrived quietly in Portland, the kind of morning that carried a chill without announcing it. The light crept through the thin curtains of Megan Dawson's small apartment, pale and hesitant, settling on the edges of furniture she had owned for years and never quite replaced. She woke before the alarm, her eyes already open, her chest tight with a familiar pressure that had been building for weeks. The hearing was today. The thought had followed her into sleep and waited there when she surfaced. She lay still for a moment, listening to the city breathe. A distant bus sighed at a stop. Somewhere a door slammed. Normal sounds, ordinary lives continuing, while hers felt suspended. Megan sat up, slowly, as if sudden movement might crack something already fragile. On the table by the window lay a stack of unanswered messages from clients. Portrait commissions she had postponed. Politely at first, then vaguely, offering apologies that grew thinner with each delay. She could not bring herself to pick up a brush when the weight of the day pressed so heavily on her hands. There had been a time when her life followed a different rhythm. Years ago, she stood for long shifts in a city cafeteria, scrubbing plates until her fingers wrinkled and ached. She had not imagined then that she would one day call herself an artist, even quietly, even with doubt. Drawing had always lived in her, persistent and patient, but necessity had pushed it aside. When she finally returned to it, she did so without training, without connections, without safety, a self-taught portrait artist in a city full of talent and competition. She scraped by, commission to commission, hope to hope. Megan dressed without ceremony. The dress she chose had seen too many seasons, its fabric softened by wear, its seams holding out of habit more than strength. Her shoes were old. The soles thinned unevenly, the leather dulled by rain and miles of sidewalks. She brushed her hair and stopped, leaving it plain. Makeup felt unnecessary, almost dishonest. A touch of color on her lips was the most she allowed herself, not to impress anyone, but to remind herself that she still existed. The mirror reflected a woman who had learned to take up less space, who had grown used to being overlooked. Outside, the air cut sharper. Leaves skittered across the pavement like nervous thoughts. The courthouse loomed ahead, gray and indifferent, its steps already busy with clerks moving briskly, lawyers checking phones, and a few journalists lingering with practiced patience. Witnesses gathered in small clusters, voices low, faces intent. Megan paused at the bottom of the steps, the wind tugging at her dress, and drew in a slow breath. Her heart thudded once, hard, then settled into a steady, exhausting rhythm. She climbed the steps and passed through security, her belongings placed in a plastic bin that slid away from her as if claiming them. The building smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. Every footstep echoed, magnified by the high ceilings. As she walked toward the courtroom, memories rose uninvited. Years of small concessions, words swallowed, apologies given for things she had not broken. The erosion had been gradual, almost invisible, until one day she could no longer remember when she had last felt solid. Megan stopped before the doors and rested her hand on the cool wood. She knew what waited inside. She knew the faces, the judgments, the laughter that might come. Yet she also knew why she was there. Not to plead, not to repair what had been dismantled piece by piece. She had come to end something that no longer had a name worth saving. When she opened the door and stepped into the corridor beyond, she did so with quiet resolve. Whatever happened next, it would be witnessed. And for the first time in a long while, Megan Dawson was ready to let the truth stand where it could not be ignored. Megan saw him the moment she stepped into the courtroom. Mark Dawson sat at the long table reserved for the parties, his posture relaxed, his shoulders squared as if he were attending a business meeting rather than the end of a marriage. He did not look up right away. He did not need to. His confidence filled the space for him. Beside him sat his mother, Evelyn Dawson, perfectly composed, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She surveyed the room with cool detachment, as though everything unfolding here were already decided. To Mark's other side sat Vanessa Cole. Vanessa's presence was unmistakable. Her dress was fashionable without being loud, tailored to suggest effortlessness. Her hair fell into place as if it had been arranged that way without thought. She leaned back slightly, one leg crossed over the other. Her lips curved into a smile that flickered between curiosity and amusement. When her eyes landed on Megan, that smile sharpened. It was not hostile. It was worse than that. It was entertained. Megan felt it immediately, the familiar tightening in her chest. She took her seat without meeting any of their gazes, aware of how she must look in comparison. The contrast was intentional, even if she had not planned it that way. Vanessa glanced at Mark and murmured something under her breath. He followed her gaze toward Megan, then exhaled through his nose in a quiet, dismissive laugh. It began subtly, a raised eyebrow, a slow look from Megan's shoes to her face. Evelyn's eyes lingered on Megan's dress, just long enough to register disapproval, before she turned away as if bored. Vanessa's smile widened, and she tilted her head, studying Megan with the open curiosity one might reserve for something outdated or misplaced. Mark finally turned fully toward her. His eyes moved over her without warmth, without recognition of shared years. "You really wore that," he said quietly, not quiet enough to keep it private. His voice carried easily in the room. "I guess you didn't have time to do anything with yourself." A few people nearby glanced up. Vanessa let out a small laugh, quick and unrestrained. Evelyn did not intervene. She merely adjusted the cuff of her jacket, her expression unreadable. Megan felt heat rise in her face. She kept her gaze forward, her jaw tightening. She had learned long ago that responding only encouraged him. Mark leaned back in his chair, clearly settling into the moment. "I mean, look at you," he continued, his tone light, conversational. "Years go by and you don't even try. You let yourself turn into—" He paused, as if searching for the right word, then smirked. "Honestly, you're like a workhorse. Reliable, maybe, but that's all." The words landed with a dull force, heavy and unavoidable. A few heads turned more openly now. Someone near the back snorted before catching themselves. A ripple of restrained laughter passed through the room, uncertain at first, then bolder as Mark's confidence signaled permission. Vanessa laughed openly this time, pressing her hand to her mouth as if surprised by her own reaction. "That's harsh," she said, though there was no reproach in her voice. Mark shrugged. "It's the truth." Megan's hands curled into fists in her lap. Her nails pressed into her palms until the sensation grounded her. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at him, at them, at anyone. Her eyes burned, but she would not let the tears fall. Not here. Not like this. The judge entered and the courtroom rose. The brief formality brought a fragile hush, though the tension lingered like a bruise. When everyone sat again, the judge reviewed the case with professional distance, then looked up. "Mr. Dawson," the judge said, "you may begin. Please state your position regarding the dissolution of this marriage." Mark stood, smoothly adjusting his jacket. He did not glance at Megan as he spoke. "Your Honor, we've been separated for some time," he said. "The marriage has been over in practice, even if it took a while to make it official." "My wife simply isn't," he paused, turning slightly now, his eyes finally meeting Megan's with cool certainty. "She isn't what I need. She hasn't been for years." He let the silence stretch. "I deserve more than someone who gave up on herself," he added. "Someone who stopped trying. I don't see why this should be complicated." Megan felt the room closing in around her. Every word was a deliberate cut, meant to reduce her, to make her smaller in the eyes of everyone watching. She breathed slowly through her nose, holding herself together by force of will alone. This was the moment she had feared. The moment where the contempt became public, undeniable, and as the judge turned his gaze toward her, waiting for her response, Megan knew there was no retreat left. For a brief second, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Megan did not answer the judge right away. She sat very still, her gaze lowered, her shoulders slightly rounded as they had been for years. Mark watched her with thinly veiled impatience, already certain of the outcome, already satisfied. He leaned toward his mother and murmured something under his breath, his mouth curling in a smug half-smile. Then Megan moved. Slowly, deliberately. She raised her hands to the neckline of her dress and began to unbutton it. The sound was small, but unmistakable in the quiet room. A soft click, then another. Mark froze. "What are you doing?" he hissed, half rising from his chair. His confidence cracked, just enough to reveal irritation beneath it. "Are you serious right now?" Megan did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. Her fingers continued their steady work, one button at a time, as if she were alone. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Someone shifted in their seat. A clerk glanced up sharply. Even the judge's expression flickered with surprise. "Sit down," the judge said sharply to Mark. Megan slipped her arms free of the worn fabric. The old dress slid from her shoulders and pooled at her feet, a dull, shapeless thing abandoned without ceremony. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly silent. Then they saw what had been hidden beneath. The turquoise dress caught the light instantly. Clean lines, a color vivid enough to draw the eye without shouting. It fit her as if it belonged to her, not borrowed, not apologetic. It was a dress she had chosen, saved for, paid for quietly, coin by coin, without permission or approval. It marked the boundary between who she had been and who she was no longer willing to pretend to be. Megan reached up and released her hair. The tight restraint she had worn loosened, and her hair fell over her shoulders in soft waves. With the movement came a change that could not be measured in fabric or color. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted. She stood not taller but fuller, as if she had finally stepped into her own outline. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Whispers. Someone in the back muttered an involuntary wow. Phones shifted in hands before being lowered again. Vanessa's smile vanished, replaced by something tight and brittle. Evelyn Dawson stared, her composed mask cracking just enough to reveal disbelief. Mark stood halfway out of his chair, his face flushed with anger and something dangerously close to panic. "This is inappropriate," he snapped. "She's trying to make a scene." But the scene was no longer his to control. The judge raised a hand, but Megan spoke before he could intervene. Her voice was calm, not loud, not trembling, calm in a way that demanded attention. "I am not a burden," she said. Every word landed cleanly without haste. "I am not property. I am not something to be used until it wears out." She turned slightly, not to face Mark directly, but to let the room hear her. "And I am not a workhorse." Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came. "I am an artist," Megan continued. "I create. I build things that did not exist before. And I will not be reduced to fit someone else's failure to see value." She did not accuse. She did not plead. She simply stated what was true. The judge looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded once. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, measured and composed, "you may proceed when ready." Megan inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than submission, and returned to her seat. The old dress remained on the floor. No one laughed now. When Megan spoke again, it was without hesitation. She rose and moved to the table with steady steps, placing a thin folder in front of her as if she had done this many times before. Inside were printed messages, photographs, and a brief list of names. Evidence gathered quietly, patiently, over months of certainty she had not wanted to reach. She handed the documents to the clerk, her fingers calm, her movements precise. "These are records of my husband's relationship with Ms. Cole," Megan said. Her voice remained level. "Text messages, call logs, photographs, and statements from individuals who were aware of the relationship while we were still married." The judge reviewed the first page, then another, his expression tightening slightly as the pattern became clear. He nodded to the clerk to distribute copies. Mark's composure began to unravel. He shifted in his seat, his jaw working as he skimmed the pages that had once lived safely on his phone, in private threads he assumed would never leave his control. Vanessa stared straight ahead, her earlier amusement replaced by a rigid stillness. Before Mark could speak, Evelyn Dawson stood abruptly. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp with practiced authority. "If my son sought comfort elsewhere, it was because his wife drove him to it. She stopped caring for her home, for her appearance for him. A marriage cannot survive that." The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Dawson, you are not a party to this case." "But I am his mother," Evelyn insisted, turning toward Megan with barely restrained disdain. "She destroyed the marriage long before any other woman appeared. A wife has responsibilities." Megan listened without reaction. The words slid past her now, familiar and strangely powerless. The judge regarded Evelyn coolly. "This court will consider evidence, not opinions." He returned his attention to the documents, then to Mark. "Mr. Dawson, do you dispute the authenticity of these materials?" Mark swallowed. "No," he said finally, his voice lower than before. "But they don't show the whole story." "They show enough to raise serious questions," the judge replied. The room settled into a heavy silence as the judge gathered his thoughts. Finally, he leaned back slightly. "Given the material presented today and the circumstances involved, this court will postpone the final ruling for 1 week. This will allow time for a full review of the evidence and any additional submissions." The gavel struck once. Megan felt a slow release in her chest, not relief exactly, but space. The moment she had braced herself for had passed. The humiliation had not been erased, but it no longer owned the room. As people stood and began to file out, Megan gathered her things. Mark avoided her eyes now. Evelyn spoke to him in a low, urgent tone, already reframing events, already planning the next offense. Vanessa slipped out ahead of them, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Megan walked out alone. The autumn air met her at the courthouse steps, cold and bracing. For the first time that day, she breathed deeply without resistance. Her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline faded, but her steps were sure. Near the entrance, beside a metal trash bin, lay the old dress she had shed inside. She picked it up. For a moment, she held it, feeling the familiar weight of fabric that had once seemed inseparable from her. Then she dropped it into the bin and let the lid fall closed. The sound was final. Megan turned away without looking back. She adjusted the turquoise dress at her shoulders, feeling its fit, its presence. She knew now that she would never again choose comfort over truth, silence over self-respect. She would not dress, speak, or live for someone else's approval. As she walked down the steps and into the city, the storm inside her had quieted. What remained was not victory yet, but something just as important. The knowledge that she had begun. The bus arrived with a low hiss of brakes, its doors folding open as Megan stepped aboard. She dropped into a seat by the window, the city sliding past in muted tones of gray and gold. The route toward Lake Oswego cut through familiar neighborhoods, and then gradually gave way to quieter streets, cleaner lines, signs of comfort she rarely moved through anymore. She adjusted her bag on her lap, already shifting her thoughts toward the portrait commission waiting ahead of her. Work, at least, still obeyed simple rules. You showed up. You did your best. You were paid or you were not. The bus lurched forward, stopping again a few blocks later. An elderly man climbed aboard from the rear entrance. His clothes were worn thin, the fabric stained and frayed at the edges. A dirty plastic bag hung from his hand, its contents indistinct. His beard was untrimmed and gray. His shoulders hunched as if he expected resistance before it arrived. He hesitated near the fare reader, patting his pockets with growing confusion. The transit officer noticed immediately. "Sir," the officer called out sharply. "Fare." The man looked up, blinking, as if pulled abruptly from another place. "I don't have it," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, worn down by use and disuse alike. "I lost everything." A ripple of discomfort moved through the bus. Some passengers turned away at once, eyes fixed on phones or windows. Others watched with thin impatience, arms crossed, already forming judgments. "No fare means no ride," the officer said, stepping closer. "You'll have to get off." The man clutched his bag tighter. "Please," he said, "just a few stops." The officer shook his head and reached for the door control. Rules are rules. Voices rose. One passenger muttered that it wasn't their problem. Another complained about delays. A woman near the front sighed loudly, tapping her foot. No one stood. No one moved toward the man. The bus felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker with indifference. Megan watched from her seat, something tightening behind her ribs. She had seen this before in different forms. The way need made people invisible. The way rules became shields. She stood. "I'll pay," she said clearly, stepping forward before doubt could catch her. "What's the fare?" The officer hesitated, surprised. "You don't know him," he said, his tone cautious. "You could be inviting trouble." "I'll pay," Megan repeated, already reaching into her bag. She tapped her card against the reader. The green light flashed. The officer stepped back, irritation giving way to resignation. "Take a seat," he muttered to the man. The elderly man turned toward Megan, his eyes wide, shining with something close to disbelief. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to." "I know," Megan replied. She offered a small, tired smile. "It's fine." He nodded and moved carefully toward an empty seat, his movements slow, deliberate. The bus rolled on. Conversations resumed, subdued now. The moment passed, absorbed into routine. A few stops later, the man rose and shuffled toward the door. Before stepping off, he paused and looked back at Megan. He did not wave. He did not speak again. He simply held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to remember her face, then disappeared into the crowd outside. Megan returned to her seat by the window. The city slid by again unchanged. Yet she felt unsettled, her thoughts circling the encounter without landing anywhere solid. It was not pride she felt, nor satisfaction, just a quiet weight, a sense that something small had been set in motion without her understanding why. She rested her forehead briefly against a cool glass and watched the road curve ahead. Compassion, she knew, rarely announced its consequences, and sometimes it returned in ways no one could predict. The bus let Megan off near a quiet, curving road lined with tall trees and manicured hedges. Lake Oswego felt removed from the city she knew, insulated by space and money. She walked the last stretch, her steps slowing as the Hart residence came into view. The house rose behind a wrought iron gate, expansive without appearing loud, its pale stone facade catching the afternoon light. Everything about it suggested permanence and control. Megan paused at the gate, adjusting the strap of her bag. She was used to entering other people's lives through their doors, but this felt different. The air itself seemed polished. A woman answered when she rang the bell. She was younger than Megan had expected, impeccably dressed, her hair arranged with precision. Her expression shifted the moment she took in Megan's appearance, lingering on the dress, the shoes, the absence of anything ornamental. "Yes," the woman asked, already cool. I'm Megan Dawson, Megan said. I'm here to paint Lucas. The woman studied her a second longer, then stepped aside. Come in. Michael is busy. Lucas is waiting. The interior was quiet in the way expensive homes often were, insulated from noise by layers of design. The floors gleamed. Framed artwork lined the walls. Chosen carefully, displayed at measured distances, Megan followed the woman through the space, acutely aware of her own presence, of how out of place she felt among the polished surfaces. In the living room, a small boy sat cross-legged on the floor, arranging wooden train tracks with careful concentration. He looked up when they entered, his face brightening immediately. You're the artist, he said, standing. His smile was open, unguarded. That's right, Megan replied, returning the smile despite herself. You must be Lucas. He nodded proudly. I'm 7. Before Megan could respond, her gaze drifted past him, and she froze. Seated on the far side of the room, in a high-backed chair upholstered in dark leather, was the elderly man from the bus. He looked nothing like he had earlier that day. Gone were the torn clothes and the plastic bag. He wore a tailored suit now, charcoal gray, his shoes polished, his hair neatly combed. Only his eyes were the same, deep-set, watchful, carrying a weight that had not belonged to a vagrant. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man inclined his head slightly, a faint, knowing expression touching his mouth. Megan, he said, as if they were old acquaintances. Her breath caught. You, Lucas, glanced between them. That's my grandpa, he said. Arthur. The woman who had let Megan in cleared her throat. Arthur Reynolds, she said curtly. Lucas's grandfather. The name landed heavily. Arthur Reynolds. The lawyer. Megan had heard it before, in conversations she'd barely followed, in passing references to courtrooms and cases that reshaped lives. A once legendary attorney, people said. Brilliant. Relentless. Others whispered that he was losing his grip now. That age had finally dulled him, that he wandered, confused, living half in memory. Arthur watched her carefully, as if measuring what she might say. I didn't recognize you, Megan managed finally. Understandable, he replied mildly. Appearances can be misleading. Footsteps approached, sharp and deliberate. A man entered the room, tall, well-dressed, his expression open but guarded. You must be Megan, he said, extending his hand. Michael Hart. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Megan shook his hand. Of course. Before anything else could be said, the woman reappeared at Michael's side. She slipped her arm through his without looking at him, her attention fixed squarely on Megan. I'm Rachel, she said, Michael's wife. The hostility was immediate, unmistakable. Rachel's eyes flicked again to Megan's dress, her mouth tightening. You're younger than I expected. I'm here to work, Megan replied evenly. Rachel smiled without warmth. We value professionalism in this house. Arthur shifted slightly in his chair. She helped me earlier today, he said quietly. Rachel's eyes snapped to him. Arthur. He met her gaze without flinching. On the bus. Michael frowned. What bus? It's nothing, Rachel said quickly. Arthur tends to exaggerate. Arthur said nothing more, but his attention remained on Megan, intent and oddly protective. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Lucas sensed it, his smile fading slightly as he clutched his toy train. Megan felt it too, the way something unspoken pressed against the edges of conversation. She set her bag down carefully. Shall we get started? She asked. Michael nodded. Yes, let's. As they moved toward the space where she would work, Megan felt the unease deepen. She could not yet name it, but it lingered in the glances exchanged, in Rachel's rigid posture, in Arthur's measured calm. This house, for all its beauty, was holding something back, and Megan had a growing sense that she had stepped into the middle of it. As Megan began to paint, The room seemed to recede. The careful arrangement of furniture, the quiet tension beneath the polished surfaces, even Rachel's watchful presence at the edge of the house, all of it softened into background noise. What remained was the canvas, the boy seated patiently before her, and the steady rhythm of her breathing. Lucas sat on a stool near the window, his favorite stuffed bear tucked under one arm. He watched Megan with open curiosity, occasionally shifting his weight, but mostly holding still with the earnest seriousness only children could manage. The afternoon light fell across his face, catching in his hair, warming his expression. Megan lifted her brush and made the first strokes, gentle and sure, and with them came the familiar drift inward. She had been a child once, too, sitting at a scarred kitchen table in a small apartment that never quite warmed in winter. Money had been an unspoken absence, felt everywhere and named nowhere. Her father's laughter had filled those rooms when she was very young, a bright sound that made even the narrow space feel larger. Then, one afternoon, he did not come home. An accident at work, a brief explanation delivered by strangers at the door, and suddenly the world narrowed instead of expanding. Her mother unraveled slowly after that. Depression settled over the household like a permanent dusk. Some days her mother functioned, moving through routines with mechanical care. Other days, she barely rose from bed. Megan learned early to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible. She learned how to cook simple meals, how to wait, how to endure. Drawing had been her escape. Pencils scavenged from school, scraps of paper rescued from the trash. She drew faces from memory, neighbors, imagined people who smiled easily. In middle school, an art teacher had noticed. She remembered the woman's hands, always smudged with charcoal, the way her eyes lit up when she looked at Megan's work. "You have something rare," the teacher had said once, holding up a sketch Megan had almost thrown away. "You see people." There had been talk of classes, of programs, of possibilities, but possibilities required money, transportation, attention, things her life could not spare. The idea faded, gently at first, then completely. Megan told herself she would return to it someday. Someday came and went without announcing itself. She mixed a new shade of paint, her hand steady, her thoughts moving on. After high school, she took the first job available. The cafeteria had been loud and hot, the work repetitive, the hours long. But it paid something, and something was better than nothing. That was where she met Mark. He had come in with coworkers, confident and joking, the kind of man who filled space without noticing it. He noticed her, or seemed to. At first, his attention felt like rescue. He complimented her drawings when he saw her sketching during breaks. He said she was special, different, wasted on a place like that. When he asked her out, she said yes with a mixture of disbelief and hope. The early days had been bright. Walks through the city, shared meals, plans spoken easily. He talked about the future with certainty, as if it were a series of steps he had already mastered. Megan listened and believed. She mistook confidence for kindness, direction for stability. Over time, the comments changed. He suggested she draw less and focus more on practical things. He said art was fine as a hobby, but not something to rely on. When money tightened, it was her spending that came under scrutiny, her ambitions that needed trimming. When years passed without children, the blame settled quietly on her shoulders, never spoken directly but always present. She tried to adjust, to be smaller, to make things easier. Respect did not vanish all at once. It eroded, grain by grain, until she found herself apologizing for existing, for wanting, for failing to become someone else. Through it all, art remained. When she could not speak, she drew. When she felt unseen, she painted faces that demanded to be acknowledged. It was imperfect, inconsistent, done in borrowed time and with borrowed confidence, but it was hers. Megan. Lucas's voice cut gently through her thoughts. She looked up, startled, then smiled. Yes. Does it hurt, he asked seriously, when people look sad? She paused, considering. Sometimes, she said honestly, but it also helps to understand them. He nodded, as if this made sense. He adjusted his bear and sat straighter. You can paint me happy, he said. I'm happy right now. Warmth spread through Megan's chest, unexpected and grounding. She returned to the canvas, her strokes surer now, infused with something steadier than memory. Lucas's presence was uncomplicated. He did not know her past. He did not weigh her worth. He simply existed, offering trust without conditions. As the portrait began to take shape, Megan felt a quiet reassurance settle in her. The years of endurance, the choices shaped by necessity rather than desire, had not erased her ability to create or to care. They had only sharpened it. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to justify her survival. She simply painted. Arthur waited until the house quieted. Lucas had been taken upstairs, his evening routine carried out with careful normalcy. Michael's voice drifted briefly from another room, low and distracted, then faded. Rachel's footsteps moved across the floor with clipped precision before disappearing behind a closed door. Only then did Arthur rise from his chair and motion subtly for Megan to follow him. They stopped in a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs, vacations, celebrations, moments staged to look effortless. Arthur studied one for a moment, then turned to her. You helped me today, he said softly. On the bus. Megan nodded. It didn't feel like much. It was, Arthur replied. He lowered his voice. And that's why I'm asking you now. She hesitated. Asking me what? Arthur glanced toward the staircase, then back at her. I believe Rachel is planning something. Something illegal. Dangerous. The word hung between them. Megan searched his face for signs of confusion, of exaggeration. She found none. His eyes were clear, focused in a way that contradicted every rumor she had heard. Michael trusts her completely, Arthur continued. That trust is being used against him, against Lucas. Megan's pulse quickened. What makes you think that? I've seen things, he said. Documents hidden where they shouldn't be. Conversations that stop when I enter a room. Devices installed under the pretense of convenience. His mouth tightened. She believes I don't notice. That I'm fading. Megan felt a chill move through her. Arthur, if you're wrong, I'm not, he said quietly. But I need proof. She understood what he was asking before he said it. A camera, he went on. Discreet. Temporary. Somewhere in her study. Just long enough to confirm what I already know. Megan's instinct was to refuse. The request crossed lines she had never imagined stepping over. Privacy. Legality. Consequences. She thought of the courtroom, of judgment, of how easily intentions could be twisted. I don't want to be part of something that could hurt you, she said carefully. Or Lucas. That's exactly why I'm asking you, Arthur replied. You don't belong to this house. You see it clearly. Megan looked down the hallway again. The polished frames, the silence, the child asleep upstairs. After a long moment, she nodded once. If we do this, she said, we do it carefully, and only to confirm the truth. Arthur inclined his head. That's all I ask. The installation took minutes. Arthur had already obtained a small camera, no larger than a paperweight, designed to blend into its surroundings. Megan's hands shook slightly as she placed it behind a row of books on a shelf in Rachel's study, angling it toward the desk. They tested the feed briefly, then powered it down. Megan left soon after, the house closing behind her with a weight that lingered long after she stepped back onto the quiet street. That night, she could not sleep. She sat at the small table in her apartment, the city humming faintly beyond the window, and opened the feed on her phone. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but the empty study, shadows shifted as the camera adjusted. Then the door opened. Rachel entered, her movements quick and efficient. She closed the door behind her and sat at the desk opening a laptop. The screen reflected faintly in the camera's lens, unreadable, but Megan leaned closer anyway, her heart beginning to race. Rachel spoke, and another voice answered through the speakers. A man. Calm. Controlled. Everything is in place, Rachel said. There was no hesitation in her tone. He signed the contracts without reading them. Thought it was routine. The man chuckled softly. And the recordings? I've been collecting them, Rachel replied. Every conversation, every admission. He won't see it coming. Megan's stomach tightened. What about the old man? The voice asked. Rachel paused. He's a problem, but manageable. People already think he's unstable. And the child? Rachel exhaled sharply. Lucas won't be touched. He's leverage, not collateral. The words landed like a blow. And when it's done, the man continued. When Michael is ruined, Rachel said. Financially, publicly. Then I walk away with everything. Megan felt cold spread through her limbs. Contracts, recordings, financial ruin. The pieces aligned with frightening clarity. This was not paranoia. It was planning. The feed went dark as Rachel shut the laptop and left the room. Megan stared at the blank screen, her breath shallow, her thoughts racing. Arthur had been right. Worse than that, he had been careful, measured, and now there was proof. Her gaze drifted to the door of her apartment, then to the quiet room around her. She thought of Lucas upstairs in his bed, trusting the world without question. She thought of Arthur, dismissed and underestimated. She thought of how easily silence could become complicity. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about preventing harm. And Megan knew there was no turning back. Megan did not sleep that night. By morning, her decision was no longer a question of courage, but of necessity. She copied the recording onto a flash drive, checked it twice, and slipped it into her bag as if it were something fragile. The city was still waking when she returned to Lake Oswego, the quiet streets unchanged, deceptively calm. Michael Hart was in the living room when she arrived, already dressed for the day, a phone pressed to his ear. He looked surprised to see her, then concerned when he noticed her expression. Michael, Megan said as soon as he ended the call, I need to speak with you. Now. He hesitated only a moment before nodding and leading her toward his study. The door closed behind them, sealing off the polished calm of the house. What's going on? He asked. Megan placed the flash drive on the desk between them. Her hands were steady. This is something you need to see. It involves Rachel. Michael frowned. If this is about Arthur. Please, Megan said quietly. Just watch. He plugged the drive into his computer. As the recording played, color drained from his face. He leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening with each word. Contracts, recordings, ruin. When Rachel's voice spoke of leverage and control, Michael's hand curled into a fist against the desk. When the recording ended, the silence was heavy. This can't be real, he said hoarsely. It is, Megan replied. Arthur was right. Michael stood abruptly. Where is she? As if summoned by the question. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her gaze flicking immediately to the computer screen. For a split second, something like calculation crossed her face. Then she understood. You went through my things, she said, her voice sharp. Her eyes snapped to Megan. You had no right. Michael turned toward her. Is this true? Rachel laughed, a short, brittle sound. Of course it's edited. You're really going to trust her over me. Arthur entered the room behind her, his movements slower, his posture guarded. Rachel, he said evenly, it's over. Her eyes flashed. You should have stayed out of it. The tension fractured. Rachel's hand moved fast, faster than anyone expected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a kitchen knife. The blade, catching the light. The room erupted into shouts. "Rachel, stop!" Michael yelled. Arthur stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between her and Megan. "Put it down," he said, his voice calm, authoritative in a way it had once been feared. She lunged. The movement was sudden, chaotic. Arthur staggered as the blade struck, a sharp cry tearing from his throat as he fell back against the desk. Megan reacted without thinking. She rushed forward, grabbing a nearby cloth, pressing it firmly against the wound. "Call 911, she said urgently to Michael. "Now." Michael's hands shook as he dialed, his voice breaking as he spoke to the dispatcher. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, staring at what she had done. Then she dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor, loud in the stunned silence. Sirens grew closer, slicing through the air outside. Megan kept pressure on the wound, her mind focused, her movements precise. Arthur gritted his teeth but did not scream. He met her eyes briefly and nodded, as if acknowledging her control. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes, the room filled with motion and commands. Arthur was placed on a stretcher, the bleeding controlled. Rachel was handcuffed, her protests hollow now, her earlier certainty dissolved into frantic denial. As she was led away, she twisted back toward Arthur. "You ruined my life," she shouted, "just like you ruined his." Arthur closed his eyes. Later, in the harsh clarity of flashing lights and official questions, the truth surfaced fully. Rachel Hart was not who she had claimed to be. Her real motive lay buried in a case Arthur Reynolds had once refused. Decades earlier, he had declined to defend a man whose crimes he believed indefensible. That man had gone to prison. He had died there. Rachel was his daughter. Her marriage to Michael had never been about love. It had been strategy, access, revenge, carefully planned and patiently executed, aimed at destroying the family of the man she blamed for her father's fate. When Arthur was taken to the hospital, conscious and stable, Michael sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "I trusted her," he whispered. Megan stood nearby, exhaustion finally catching up to her. She counted on that. Michael looked up at her, his eyes red. "You saved us. All of us." Megan said nothing. She thought of the bus ride, of the choice that had seemed so small at the time, of how close everything had come to irreversible damage. Justice had not arrived cleanly or quietly. It had come with risk and blood and the narrowest margin of timing. But it had arrived, and the lies that had held this house together collapsed all at once, leaving only the truth behind. The final divorce hearing took place on a gray morning that felt quieter than the first, as if the world itself had stepped back to watch what would remain. Megan sat upright at the same table, her hands resting calmly before her. She felt different now, not armored, not hardened, but steady. Across the room, Mark Dawson looked smaller than he had weeks before. His confidence had thinned into restlessness, his posture tense, his gaze darting instead of fixed. The easy certainty he once carried had abandoned him. When Arthur Reynolds entered the courtroom, a subtle shift passed through the space. He walked without hesitation, his suit immaculate, his expression clear and alert. Any trace of confusion that had once been whispered about him was gone. He took his place beside Megan with quiet authority, a presence shaped by decades of precision and restraint. When he spoke to her briefly, his voice was low and reassuring. Not paternal, not performative, simply present. The judge called the session to order. Arthur rose when it was his turn to speak. He did not waste words. He laid out the facts with careful structure, guiding the court through financial records, timelines, and documented inconsistencies. What had once been dismissed as coincidence now formed a pattern. Assets diverted, accounts manipulated, transactions hidden behind technical language and assumed ignorance. Mark attempted to interrupt. Arthur did not look at him. He explained how trust had been exploited, how Megan had been kept deliberately uninformed, how marital finances had been treated as tools rather than shared responsibility. Each point was supported, each claim anchored to evidence. The room listened. When Mark's attorney responded, the arguments felt thin by comparison, defensive, fragmented. The judge asked questions, precise and pointed, and Mark's answers faltered. The image he had relied on, of a woman diminished, of a story he could control, no longer held. The ruling followed without drama. Mark Dawson was found responsible for financial misconduct connected to the marriage. Assets he had assumed were untouchable were reassigned. His attempts to obscure ownership were exposed. His credibility, once casually asserted, was dismantled piece by piece. Megan heard the words without shock, not because they did not matter, but because she had already released the need for them to define her worth. When the judge concluded, Megan felt a quiet finality settle over her. The marriage was dissolved, the obligations severed. What remained was hers alone. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. Megan paused on the steps, absorbing the ordinary sounds of the city. People passed without noticing her, unaware that something significant had ended and something else had begun. Later that afternoon, she returned to Lake Oswego to finish Lucas's portrait. The boy greeted her with the same uncomplicated warmth, climbing onto his seat without being asked. He watched her work with quiet interest, occasionally asking thoughtful questions, occasionally drifting into silence. Megan painted with focus and care, allowing the image to form without force. When she stepped back at last, the portrait held more than likeness. It carried gentleness, presence, an unguarded honesty that felt rare and precious. Michael stood beside her, studying the canvas. "You captured him," he said softly, "the way he is." Megan nodded. "He makes it easy." Michael hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I want you to know, what you did for my family can't be repaid. But if you choose to stay connected, to teach Lucas, to work here, you'll be respected, supported, on your terms." Megan met his gaze. She heard no urgency in his voice, no implication of rescue or obligation. Only an offer, clearly defined. "I appreciate that," she said, "and I'll think about it." That night, alone in her apartment, Megan sat by the window and watched the city lights come on one by one. Her life had not become perfect. Loss still existed. Uncertainty remained. But something fundamental had shifted. She had endured quietly when speaking seemed impossible. She had acted when action became necessary. She had chosen dignity when it would have been easier to shrink. Justice, she understood now, was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived slowly, carried by patience, by clarity, by the refusal to disappear. Kindness had not vanished into nothing when she offered it on a bus. It had returned, transformed at the moment it mattered most. Megan rested her hands at her lap and breathed evenly. Her story was no longer about what had been taken from her. It was about what remained. For those listening, have you ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly dismissed? What helped you reclaim your sense of worth when no one else seemed to see it? Your story matters too.